Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Enders, and I'm a media analyst and have been for over 30 years. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the rapid evolution in the television landscape and how it is that some of the models are going to play out. So the first thing to say is that there's a huge variability in the size of the industries in Europe. You can see that Germany and the UK, although they have different populations, Germany with over 36 million homes, the UK with 25 million, these are equivalent. The UK spends more on content, on culture, on magazines, on newspapers, on DVDs, on the cinema, on everything, pay TV included, advertising, density. The yield in the UK is massive because the UK has actually got the highest media consumption of television in Europe, around 4.5 hours a day. So that's why it's so significant. France, you can see, is somewhat less than the UK despite having equivalent population. And Italy is smaller, Spain, Netherlands, and so on. Italy and Spain are small markets also because of the prevalence of piracy and also because the economies of these countries are very, very badly afflicted. So the other thing to note is that this chart shows that from 2003 to 2013, there has actually been no change at all in the structure of viewing for all adults. So this shows that the launch of Freeview in the UK, the internet age, the UK going from 15% broadband to 85% has had no real impact on the shape of viewing. People are primarily in a linear experience. And the linearity aspect is extraordinary because at the dawn of this time in 2003, one of those lines, actually most people believed that nonlinear viewing would dominate by 2010, instead of which it's only around 12%, and most of that nonlinearity is generated by PVRs in the UK, which around 60% of households have adopted. So actually, that's about the same as video viewing in the VCR time. But what's actually happening behind the scenes of that extraordinary regularity of linearity is actually that different demographics are doing different things. In the UK, we've had a massive increase in viewing from 2009 onwards, as you can tell. And that was generated in part by the negative macro environment. People started watching television more because it's so cheap. I mean, cheap compared to the cinema, cheap compared to going to a restaurant, cheap compared to going shopping. But you can see that within here, there are extraordinary changes in the demographic behavior. So if you look at the blue line, which is children, you'll see that in 2005 to 2008, there was a massive decline in their viewing to conventional linear TV. That was generated by the launch of YouTube, and that effect passed through, and in fact, they went back to conventional television because of the growth of HD and because of the arrival of massive television sets and the home center. So that's what happened with them. But you can see that since 2011, children 16 to 34s and even 35 to 54s are moving away from the linear experience, and they're going somewhere else. So one of the things, small impact on all of this, is Netflix, which actually launched in the UK in January 2012, and we are the most successful country for Netflix because people pay more for television, and the people who take Netflix are already payers, which is why you can find Netflix on Virgin Media's cable system, and that is going to be a very good source for them. Netflix spends $2 billion a year in the US, and it buys stuff and makes stuff that you cannot show on conventional television because the average body count is 15 per hour. Things like Breaking Bad, that Channel 4 had to reject. I mean, conventional public service broadcasting cannot absorb shows that are and should be on HBO, like Game of Thrones, or on Sky Atlantic, like Game of Thrones, or Breaking Bad on Netflix. So what's really happened is that there is a real flight to quality in the UK. People only watch amazing stuff. things that cost $10 million an hour. That is the competitive landscape. Now, where are all these kids going? Okay, as I often explain to the BBC, which is worse afflicted because the public service broadcasters have had the worst erosion of young viewing, you can't compete with pornography. That large blob, which is so much bigger than YouTube, is in fact pornography viewing. And 90% of males in this country are viewing pornography. 90%, 9-0. And some women too. I suppose to understand what they see in it, who knows? Or as those popular culture people would say, they're actually looking at it to understand what men want these days, right? Anyway, but you can see that YouTube is the dominant life form in the conventional space, followed by the BBC iPlayer, and then by ITV. So you can see that actually, certainly in the case of the BBC and ITV, they've got, and Channel 4, they're actually doing quite well by positioning their products in the internet space. And so they're generating some income from video advertising, and they're above all generating, particularly in the case of Channel 4, an engine of future growth in the shape of data. So this is really part of the future for the conventional public service broadcasting model, and one which has been very successful in the UK. What I'm trying to tell you about the UK is that it is a powerhouse, and above all, a powerhouse of consumption, and eventually, over the last decade, that has enabled the UK to be a powerhouse of export. The movie industry here has tripled since 1998, and the TV industry has also tripled. So we're looking at massive sums that can be deployed for content. And therefore, YouTube, although a good experience, is actually really only there for short form. And actually what we can tell you with absolute certainty is that consumers do not watch algorithm-driven phenomena because they're algorithm-driven. Most of the viewing on YouTube that can be monetized is of conventional broadcasts. But in the UK, unlike the US, where YouTube is a more significant phenomenon, the broadcasters have their own platforms and do not rely on YouTube, although about 10% of their traffic does in fact come from YouTube. So what this shows is something quite remarkable, which is if you strip out the overheads of the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Sky, 5, BT, and YouTube, you get to a number for content spend. And what this shows is that if you are the BBC, ITV, Channel 4 or 5, you actually have a really interesting situation because you get the media consumption that aligns perfectly with your expenditure. Now, this is a remarkable phenomenon to achieve. It shows an oligopoly at work around programming. But you can see from the size of these bubbles that this is a massive amount of expenditure that is going on to bring wonderful, interesting content to a very demanding viewer. Now, if you were to put the media consumption of BT, and this is before the acquisition of the Champions League, it would be one small point because it represents substantially less than 1% of consumption. So BT is the biggest spender for the least effect. And of course, that will continue probably forever. But what this shows is that British viewers love high quality. Thank you so much.